Corsair Clockworks, Chapter 3, in which Andrea Corsair receives word from the front. Andrea's harrowing experience in the less reputable streets of Saint-Emile was largely edited in the telling to her parents. Certainly having the son of the local baron step up to the door of Corsair Clockworks in order to ensure she was safe had raised eyebrows, so much that the pathetic state of the wrapping paper that Andrea had purchased on errand had been ignored. Thus, after marginally cleaning herself up, and her mother had been finishing the last duties for dinner, the eyes of her deeply concerned father and her exuberant younger sister had been glued to her. Andrea had described her unfortunate turn which had gotten her hopelessly lost, the several more turns which had nearly had her walking into the river docks after dark, and her by chance encounter with none other than Sir Alan Ventaris. As she spoke, Andrea felt a warmth come to her cheeks, and a smile creep up around her lips that she simply couldn't hide. She left her adventure at that, not feeling the need to worry her parents with the Magus who had literally flown into her back and spilled her onto the cobblestone, nor the unsavory men who had been pursuing him. While her mother seemed to sense that something was missing, remaining unreadable as she always did when processing information, her father only looked outwardly worried for Andrea's sake. Julia, on the other hand, punctuated the end of Andrea's story with a sharp thump of her hand on the table. "Sir Ventaris!" she gasped, her vibrant green eyes speaking that even at 12 she was not unaware of the fact that any number of girls would have died to spend that long at the handsome young nobleman's side. "You dog!" A blush coming to Andrea, she leaned her jaw on her hand and nodded subtly. Admittedly, she shouldn't take such pleasure in being the center of attention, but her much prettier younger sister often took that spot, and so for the moment she felt no guilt in the slightest for ruffling Julia's feathers. Her mother at last spoke as she pulled the serving tray away from the stove. "What I'm more concerned with is how you managed to get lost from market," she began as she spooned stewed vegetables into small bowls for the four at the table. Her brown eyes raised to Andrea only a moment, deflating her dreaminess as she added, "How many times have we been there, Andrea? Honestly, you could lose your head if it wasn't glued onto your shoulders." Julia scoffed at this and eagerly leaned forward in her seat. "Don't you see, Mother," she began with a brilliant smile, "it's destiny. He's going to steal her away from such lowly errands as fetching paper, and whisk her away to the baronial manor," she finished with a sweeping motion of her hand. As much as the scenario had played out in Andrea's head that night, her gentle blush became a violent red and her jaw dropped. "Julia!" she gasped, aghast that she would make such a suggestion at the dinner table. Finally, the conversation had taken an unexpected turn enough for her father to raise his voice. Rubbing his temples painfully, the green eyes he shared with his youngest child stared off in another direction, and he heaved out a weak, Is now really the time for this?" Now cutting into the roast, unshaken by Julia's outburst, Mother shook her head. "No, perhaps there is no better time. Some might say it's late. Andrea is 17 now. It's high time for her to be looking for a suitor." This only caused Father's shoulders to slump slightly, and he mumbled out, "Oh dear." The meat, bread, and bowls of vegetables now arranged on plates, Mother began passing them out. As though it were as mundane as speaking on the weather, she tossed out, "Which only reminds me, the grocer's son is your age, isn't he? Gregory?" Andrea began to sink in her seat uncomfortably, picturing Gregory's trunk-like legs and red face rimmed with sweat. More than that, she could hear his absolutely grating laugh as he made lewd gestures at girls passing. This was not the sort of behavior he showed at the storefront, but was certainly happy to make if passing the girls' school. "He's a good, strong young man," her mother finished, setting Andrea's plate in front of her. "Mother," Andrea drew out through tight lips, glancing away, "he won't even look at me." Which was true. She could still recall him pointing at her large ears and glasses as a young girl, and his opinion of her hadn't changed as years went on. Honestly, someone like Gregory would more than likely be turning his attentions onto Julia in a few years, with her budding figure that was undoubtedly going to shape like their mother's, and shimmering gold waves that surrounded her heart-shaped face. At the sound of Gregory's name, A devilish smile came to Julia, and she nudged Andrea meaningfully. "Greg's too busy looking at Sharon Whittleman behind the shop, right?" Never a fan of gossip, especially inappropriate gossip, her father's voice piped up, much stronger this time. He was still leaning into his hand, but firmly said, "That is more than enough of that at the table." As Mother set his plate in front of him, Father looked up at her. All too eager to shift the conversation, he asked, "What about that letter you received from Theo?" At the sound of their brother's name, both Andrea and Julia sat up straighter in their seats, and they glanced at each other excitedly. Their mother, however, tightened her brow in concern, even as she reached for the front pocket of her apron. "Are you sure this is much more appropriate a subject for the table?" she asked calmly. "Mama, please," Julia chirped, leaning forward in her chair. "We haven't heard word in over a month," Andrea added. With an audible sigh, Mother pulled folded paper from her apron. "Very well. Let's see," she began softly, unfolding the pages and looking over them. "To my loved ones," she read aloud. "Mother and Father, Andrea and Julia. I hope this letter finds you in good spirits. I'm afraid there is little I can reveal to you at this time. The front looms ever closer. The North Star sails the skies better than any ship ever did the sea. Andrea," she continued, Mother's brown eyes glancing to her as she read, "I know you long to see the creations of the Mechanists' Guild, these flying gunboats. Sadly, there is nothing I can do to describe the vessel on account of what I am allowed to write, and how useless my hand would be to properly paint a picture for you. To stand by the deck and stare down at the Divine's creation from his eyes. Words fail me." Andrea's eyes sparkled as her mother read, thinking back to the boat which she and Alan had stood in the shadow of earlier that evening. The sails billowing in the wind, the bow touching nothing but air as it glided. "Instead," Mother read on, "I have been told I can at last reveal what has occurred in Suzdal Nurgovod." She read slowly as not to stumble on the foreign words. "The uprising was of the lower classes, led by the distant cousins of the Mechanist Guilds, the engineers. By the thousands they rose up, cutting down the bloodlines of Suzdal Nurgovod." This new turn to the correspondence caused Andrea's smile to fade instantly. She glanced at her father and saw his eyebrows draw tight in deep thought. Seeming to falter on the words, Mother cleared her throat before she continued. "We are told to assume none in the nobility live. If we are wrong, then it is but a small victory in this campaign. These anarchists, as they have been called, are much more organized than previously assumed. In fact, anarchist is no longer a word used against them." Andrea's shoulders began to fall again, shaken by this reminder of what brutality and danger her older brother would surely face, and she felt Julia's hand on her shoulder in shared concern. "It is said by those who have seen the edges of the former kingdom of Suzdal Nurgovod," Mother continued, "now the Free State or Anarchist State, whatever words you use for that hell of gray skies and dense smoke. Few of the sweeping streets of guild and beauty survive. These free men have even torn down much of their history in favor of a new, cold uniformity. Thankfully, this I have not seen. Sadly, as you can see, I have nearly run out of paper and of time. Know that my thoughts are with you, and this conflict will not be a long one. No man who disregards history, beauty, and above all honor can survive against the might of the Empire and her allies. It will not be long before I return to Saint Emile. Father, I expect to hear of the success you have found with your new mechanical singing birds. Mother, I expect to receive a meal far better than I stomach on the front. And Andrea and Julia, I expect to see you grown even more than when we last saw one another. Take care that it is not too much. Your son and brother, Theodore Corsair." Mother's voice finally grew quiet, making the terrible silence hanging over the dinner table heavy and disquieting. Andrea stared at her rapidly chilling meal with little more than hollow disinterest, and saw the rest of her family reacting in much the same manner. After a long pause, Julia's voice was the first to break the silence. "Well, now I'm not hungry," she grumbled, leaning her jaw into her hand and picking at her meat sourly. Andrea was the first to retire to she and Julia's room, the events of the day and evening heavy on her mind. She changed into her long pink nightgown and sat at the vanity, pulling her dirty blonde hair from the braids that circled her head like a crown. It was such a relief to undo the braids that had been through so very much that day. As the full length of her hair tumbled down her back, she began to brush out the day's worth of wear bit by bit. Too much for one day, she thought as she ran the brush through straw-colored strands, taking care not to knock off her glasses. She was rather selfish when she thought on it. Being scolded for being so absent-minded or clumsy, or for keeping her head in fancies more than reality, even Mrs. Castleberry and her schoolmates were all piddling complaints next to her brother's task. He was hundreds of miles away, a rifle at his side in service to the Empire. What honest right did she have to think only of her childish dreams? Perhaps her mother was right. Perhaps it really was time to let go of fancies and focus on her duty as a woman. Perhaps being ordinary was all that was meant for her. What should she focus on first? Improving her schoolwork was a good place to start. Then her mind drifted to that elusive, warm smile on Alan's face. His golden red hair lit by lamplight, those soft hazel eyes seeming to shift from brown to green with his mood. She had heard of the man just the same as every dreamy girl of St. Emile, but to see him in person, for him to offer his time so charitably, he had been even better than she had imagined. However, her eyes caught her own in the mirror, and another twinge of self-pity rose. Brushed out, her limp, lifeless hair draped down her shoulders like a rumpled curtain, and her brown eyes, bordering on an unsettling gold, stared back at her from behind the rims of her glasses. Her upturned nose was cast into heavy shadows made by the room's solitary oil lamp, and her hair was pushed out ever so slightly by her unnecessarily large ears. What was she even thinking? What would a man of stature and poise want with a girl who fancied clocks more than sewing? Or, she shuddered at even the thought, dancing. But that smile he had given her. Oh, if only a plain girl could have a chance. As she finished this thought, she set her brush down. It bumped against her purse, and she jumped slightly in surprise, shaken from her mental wanderings. Something unexpected happened as her purse flopped onto its side. The soft thud that should have been heard was drowned out by the sound of metal clattering on her desk, and a foreign tube slipped from her open purse. She gaped at the object, blinking in bewilderment. Andrea took the metal tube in her hands, staring at it and the intricate series of dials and seams that covered its surface. Of even more interest was the green wax seal that rested over a pair of soft black ribbons that wrapped around it. The seal was unusual, a serpent coiling its head around the pupil of a stylized eye. As she turned it in her hands, her sharp hearing picked up a hollow sound, parts suspended in some form of mechanism, and something that perhaps sounded like sloshing. Liquid, maybe? But there was also a shifting of perfectly dry contents. This was a message scroll, as strange as it was. When had she picked this up? Ah, of course, the young Magus. The young man had been a member of the Magus Guild, a journeyman. As she recalled, when they had collided, the contents of her purse had spilled over the stones. He must have dropped it, and she had absent-mindedly scooped it up with the rest of her possessions. To be fair, those brigands had been taking up more of her attention than what she had been rearranging in her purse. It seemed Andrea was faced with a bit of a quandary. How would she give this to that young journeyman? In his terse, hostile exchange of words with Alan, he hadn't bothered to supply a name. However, that Magus had made it clear he was a member of the guild, so maybe taking the message tube to the guild house would suffice. A tiny smile on Andrea's face grew by degrees as she thought harder. Well, this tube was obviously very important. Her mind raced with the possibilities of some poor woman being held for ransom by an evil duke who would force her into marriage if the guild was not sent to her rescue, or perhaps a map to some ancient treasure known only by mages, and it would certainly be a shame if it never reached its intended recipient straight away. Perhaps this was fate. Andrea was the only one who would be able to supply this message. Lives could very well be in peril. Eagerly she dug in her drawer and pulled out her metalworking tools. All worn, well-loved tools her father had passed to her when he had purchased newer ones, and spread them out on the vanity. There was no doubt about it. This message scroll had a mechanism, and her unique ability to discern sounds would aid her in revealing this message's secrets. She leaned close to the table, propping her elbows as she craned her ear as close to the tube as she could. She then carefully took one of the tools in hand and began to slip it between the dials. For some strange reason, she had the feeling that dials had little to do with any kind of combination. While they could turn, they were purely cosmetic. Her suspicions were confirmed as she heard her tools brush against several locks. And had that been glass? None of which would have logically fit in with the dials of a combination lock. She leaned her ear closer and could pick up the metal tap and gradually move as she delicately guided her hand, her other gripping the case tightly. Finally, a new sound rang out, a beautiful-sounding click. There! That had done it. Andrea was all smiles as she straightened herself. Her excitement growing, she pulled open the top of the scroll case. The wax and ribbon tore dramatically, and she slipped out the rolled paper inside. Someone had certainly gone through a lot of trouble to protect that innocent-looking piece of parchment, and she would make certain she would bring it directly to its proper owner once she had perused its contents. At that moment, a new noise reached her ears. It was a bizarre one that was a sort of bubbling hiss. Andrea's eyes turned to its direction, and the strange, stinging smell that accompanied it, and gasped out loud. The other end of the tube lay open on her desk, and now a clear liquid was spilling out onto the vanity. The liquid was burning a hole through the table rapidly, and Andrea spent only a moment gawking dumbly before she was on her feet and holding the tube. She stared into it, and saw where that sound like glass must have been coming from. There indeed was a coiling length of very fine tubing lining the inside of the scroll case. Goodness, if she hadn't been careful, this liquid would have splashed directly in her face. Then her attentions went back to the vanity and the bits of melted wood around the small hole that were crumbling into the drawer below. When she listened, she realized the liquid showed no signs of stopping. The contents of the vanity were now in danger. After some scrambling to move aside she and Julia's possessions from the ravenous fluid, she closed the drawer and hoped the chain of decay would cease soon. Mopping it up would only eat whatever she used to do so. As far as the surface of the vanity, a potted plant would simply have to cover it until Andrea could think of something better. If her mother saw the hole in the furniture, Andrea would never hear the end of it. Frazzled, Andrea caught her breath and then looked to the parchment sitting on her stool where she had left it. "Well," she said aloud, "after all that effort, I believe I've earned the right to see what someone worked so hard to hide." She picked up the scroll and cautiously unrolled the paper. The first thing that struck her was not words, few as they were on the page, but a brief sense of light-headedness that faded as soon as it arose. A whirring chime rang in her ears, rattling through her head and seeming to send the text on the page in a blur. Tightly, she clasped her eyes shut and shook her head. It finally passed completely. She blinked several times, glancing at the curtain covering the window, and dismissed the feeling as only her act of imagination. The message on the paper was only this: Correspondence to War Master, 88th Division. Repelled from Tolsev River front. Moderate losses. Airship support needed to retake position. Riverfront high priority. Captain Bram Fraser. Andrea's stomach began to sink. This was clearly not a ransom note, nor a treasure map, or even some form of intrigue between lovers torn apart. This was for the war effort against Suzdal Nurgovod. She now felt extremely guilty about reading this, and the amount of measures that had been taken to seal away its contents suddenly made much more sense. Funny, for something so important, it had said very little. As Andrea began to think on what she would do now, and the unfortunate possibility she could be in a great deal of trouble for opening war correspondence, another noise broke the room's quiet. This one came from her window, and she stared at it curiously. She and Julia's room stood over the entrance to the clock shop, on the second story above the archway and facing the street. There were no trees to cause tapping, and no person could reach the glass. Was someone throwing pebbles at her window? She walked over to the curtains, feeling the gentle, early summer breeze from the open portal, and untied the draws. As the curtains parted to reveal the night sky, Andrea let out a sharp yelp of dismay and jumped back from the window. Sitting on her windowsill, staring directly into her face, was a hawk. The bird of prey, his brown plumage accented by vibrant orange, looked up at her with its sharp, piercing eyes. It was not startled by her reaction in the slightest, nor showed any signs of doing anything other than remaining and staring. Nice, birdie, she stammered out, keeping her hands close to her chest, for surely they would look enticing to a meat-eating bird. Now, go away, she said cautiously, only barely edging closer to her window. The bird took a casual step forward, his talons clacking against the wood. No, she forced out. Don't come in. Horrified, she began to wave her hands rapidly. Shoo! She shoved out noncommittally. A spark of intelligence shone in the bird's eyes as it looked up at her. An almost twinge of an eyebrow could be seen in its unchanged expression. It promptly began preening instead of obeying her command. As she let out several resigned whimpers, unsure of what to do next, a voice began. "This is Pascal," the familiar voice said. Andrea's eyes turned from the bird with his beak buried in his wing, straight up. She stared in the face of a man her age, his arms folded across his chest, though hidden under layers of cloak and baggy clothing. His brown eyes barely peered through a mess of dark brown bangs, the rest of his hair tied in a tail that fluttered in the wind outside the window. This was the mage from earlier, the journeyman carrying the message. However, the fact that she knew him was not the first thing on her mind, nor the fact that he was floating a story off the ground, nor that he had somehow found her when they had not exchanged names and definitely not addresses. As he began to speak some nonsense on the bird being his familiar, only one fact jumped to her thoughts. "I'm not decent!" she gasped scandalously, throwing her arms around herself. Honestly, the nerve! He was all but gawking at Andrea in her nightclothes. Shocked into silence, his face going red instantly, the mage suddenly realized the error he had made in approaching a lady's window at night. "Pardon," he blurted, spinning around to face the other direction. Angrily, Andrea snatched up a robe and slipped into it, trying to listen to determine if her family had noted the outburst, but heard no one approaching. As she did, the Magus's tenuous hold on flight wavered for a moment, and he blundered out several more dry, faltering sounds before he finally cleared his throat deeply. While fascinated with seeing the young man in magical flight, the intruder was not a welcome one. "What do you think you're doing outside of my window?" she asked flatly, leaning on the windowsill, not even giving a second glance to Pascal, who still rested there and turned his head to watch them both. The Magus's shoulders squared, and his voice returned with renewed confidence. "You have something that doesn't belong to you, miss," he said firmly. "Only because you couldn't watch where you were going earlier," she reminded him with a scoff. "Maybe," he allowed. "But I must have it back, immediately." She recollected the pieces of the tube and scroll and fit them back together. The distant thought that she could be in trouble with the military returned to her, but she put on a brave face for her own benefit. "Fine, take the silly thing," she announced, holding the case to his back. His hand reached out and awkwardly took hold of it without him turning. "You have no idea how important this message is to the Empire," he informed her strongly. Still smiling, she let out a gentle sigh, as if to say, "It's no matter now." "Well, it's all back together. No harm done." Unfortunately, the mage was not done speaking. "For several thousand miles I traveled, alone, to bring this directly to the guard posted here," he continued with a clear air of self-importance, his hands turning over the scroll as he studied it. and my mission will not be stopped by. It was in that moment that he paused, and without even a single breath, spun back to face her. He craned sharply into her face, his knuckles resting on the windowsill, and each hand clearly holding only half of the case. "Wait, you opened it?" he shouted furiously. "What in the 9 pits were you even thinking, you stupid girl?" She folded her arms around herself, his words stabbing into her harshly. How else was I to know who to return it to?" she stumbled out, her face clearly hurt. Oh dear, if he was this angry, then she was in trouble after all. To her question, he only pointed at where the seal once sat, practically livid. Try asking about a seal instead of breaking it? Her stomach doing somersaults, she folded her arms more tightly. "Don't call me stupid," she snapped bitterly. "There was nothing in your silly message anyway." His anger subsiding, the Magus's expression sank into dismay. "Wait, you read it too?" "I just wanted to know who to return it to," she answered defensively. "I didn't plan to keep it. It didn't even say anything I could remember if you asked me." His face deep in thought, the mage's hands sank back into his cloak, and his eyes thinned. A moment passed in silence, then he responded, "Fine." From his cloak, the magus produced his wand, the strangely carved stick that fit snugly in his thickly gloved hands. His stance began to shift, and slowly he floated back from the window. "Pascal," he added to his familiar, "follow." The bird's head perked up, and it flapped its orange and chestnut-colored wings out several times before it leapt from the windowsill. "Don't tell a soul you opened this," the magus called back to her as he began to drift away. "I wasn't going to," she shouted in return. "And forget everything you saw," he added with a point of warning. "I already have." Not even allowing another word to escape the young man, Andrea slammed the window shut. In childlike frustration and shame at how much the exchange had affected her, she heavily flopped onto her bed. Fighting back tears and sullenly staring at the headboard of her bed, she wearily pulled off her glasses. She was a stupid girl. Stupid for thinking that a message meant for someone far more important than her would have provided her an adventure rather than scolding. Such things simply never happened. She buried her face into the pillow and tried to pry her thoughts away from the magus soaring without wings into the night sky, his graceful familiar beside him. Who needed a stupid adventure anyway? Who needed marvelous machines, or the handsome sons of barons, or anything other than chalk-covered school dresses and red-faced, beastly grocers? This was Andrea Corsair's existence, and nothing would ever change it.
Corsair Clockworks is an Ever Tomorrow production, plot by Jessie Lynn Jones and Marlon de Rivera, and written and performed by Jessie Lynn Jones. For more audio fiction, click the links and subscribe today so you'll always be ready for the next chapter. For the next chapter. For the next chapter. For the next chapter.